He had everything: success, wealth, power, but when the little girl appeared at his wedding, claiming to be his daughter, everything he thought he knew about himself came crashing down. As he stood there, staring at the child who resembled him more than he could deny, one question lingered in his mind: how had he missed this? And could he ever make it right? Edward Holmes stood at the edge of the ballroom, his eyes scanning the room filled with friends, family, and colleagues. The excitement of the day, the wedding day, had been building for weeks. Everything was perfect. He had worked tirelessly, as he always did, to ensure that this day would be flawless. The venue was breathtaking, the decorations elegant, the guests all in attendance, and most importantly, his bride-to-be, Emily, was radiant. She was everything he had ever wanted: intelligent, beautiful, and ambitious. Together, they had built a life that he believed was the perfect next step toward the future they had dreamed of. He had never felt more certain about a decision than he did about marrying Emily. As the orchestra played softly in the background, Edward adjusted his tie, the weight of his business responsibilities momentarily lifted as he prepared to marry the woman he loved. His thoughts wandered to their life together, the private getaways, the dinners, the long conversations about their dreams for the future. They had built a strong foundation, and today, they would make it official. It was a moment he had envisioned for so long. But as the ceremony began, something unexpected happened that would turn everything he knew upside down. The doors at the back of the room opened, and a small figure appeared in the doorway. At first, Edward didn't think much of it, maybe a late guest or a child looking for their parents, but when the figure stepped forward, he froze. The girl was young, around 6 years old, with light blonde hair and strikingly familiar blue eyes. She wasn't dressed for the occasion, and her presence was completely unexpected. But what truly stunned Edward was the way she walked toward him with purpose, ignoring the stares of the guests. She approached him directly, her small feet shuffling nervously as she made her way to the altar. The music seemed to fade into the background, and for a moment, everything else around him disappeared. The girl stopped a few steps away from him, her eyes fixed on his with an intensity that seemed almost too serious for someone so young. Without hesitation, she spoke. "You're my dad." The words hit Edward like a thunderclap. His breath caught in his throat, and he stared at her in disbelief. His first instinct was to laugh it off, to brush it aside as a child's fantasy or a misunderstanding. But there was something in her eyes, a certainty, a depth, that told him she wasn't playing. She looked at him like she knew exactly who he was, as though she had been waiting for this moment for years. The room seemed to hold its breath, and Edward felt a wave of panic rise in his chest. He didn't have children. He hadn't fathered any kids, as far as he knew. This little girl couldn't possibly be his daughter. He would have known. There must have been some mistake. Maybe she was lost, or perhaps her mother had brought her in, hoping for a moment of sympathy. He glanced over at Emily, who was equally stunned, her face a mask of confusion and shock. "Who are you?" Edward asked, his voice shaky as he tried to steady himself. The girl didn't flinch. "I'm Sophia," she said simply, her eyes still locked on his. "You're my dad." Edward's mind raced. He couldn't remember ever meeting her mother, nor could he recall any romantic relationship that could have resulted in a child. His mind was a blur of confusion as he tried to piece together the situation. He had no idea what to do, how to react, or what was expected of him. The weight of the room's silence pressed on him as everyone watched, waiting for him to respond. He took a hesitant step forward, his hands trembling as he reached for the envelope she was holding out to him. The letter inside was written in neat handwriting, and as he read it, the words felt surreal. It was a letter from her mother, a woman from his past whom he had long forgotten. The letter explained everything: the brief relationship they had shared, the child they had together, and how she had kept Sophia's identity hidden from him. The woman had passed away several years ago, and now Sophia had come looking for him. She had been searching for her father, the man she had only ever known in stories and in dreams. Edward could barely process what he was reading. His world, which had felt so secure just moments ago, now felt like it was crumbling. How could he have missed something so important? How could he not have known that he had a child? The shock was overwhelming. He felt like a stranger in his own life, standing in front of a little girl who claimed to be his daughter, with no idea how to react. As the room continued to watch, the sounds of the wedding ceremony seemed to fade, and for the first time in his life, Edward felt a deep sense of uncertainty. Everything he had worked so hard to build, everything he thought he knew about himself, was now in question. He looked at Sophia, her bright blue eyes filled with both hope and fear, and he realized that his life was about to change in a way he could never have anticipated. He wasn't sure how to respond, what the next step would be, or even how to explain the emotions swirling inside him. But he knew one thing for certain: this wasn't the future he had imagined, and it was one that he couldn't simply walk away from. Edward stood frozen, the weight of the letter in his hand heavier than he could have imagined. His gaze flickered from the words back to the small girl standing before him, her wide blue eyes staring up at him with a mixture of uncertainty and hope. It was as if the entire room had disappeared, leaving only him and this child who had just upended his world. For a moment, the wedding, the guests, even Emily, who stood there in shock, her eyes filled with confusion, faded into the background. All that existed was this inexplicable truth: a daughter he had never known about, standing before him, claiming to be his. He looked down at the letter once more, trying to absorb the details, but it felt surreal, like reading the pages of someone else's life. The woman who had written it was someone he barely remembered, a fling from years ago. He couldn't even recall her name fully. How could he have missed something so significant? The letter spoke of a brief relationship, a moment in time he had forgotten, and yet, here was the child that resulted from it. It felt like a lifetime ago, and yet, the reality of it was suddenly all too present. Sophia, Edward muttered under his breath, repeating the name she had given him. It was still impossible to believe, and yet there she was, a living, breathing child claiming him as her father. He glanced at the other guests, but no one seemed to know what to say. It was as though time had stopped. The orchestra's music, which had once filled the air with joy and elegance, was now an eerie silence that surrounded him. Finally, Edward turned to Emily, his fiancée, whose face was now pale, her lips slightly parted in shock. She hadn't said a word since the girl spoke, but her expression was enough to show the whirlwind of emotions inside her. Edward didn't know what to say to her either. How could he explain this to Emily? How could he justify this sudden revelation when he himself was struggling to make sense of it? The woman he was about to marry deserved an explanation, but there were no words that could make this make sense. He slowly approached Sophia, his heart pounding in his chest. "Sophia, I don't know what to say," he began, his voice trembling. "I don't understand how this is possible." Sophia stood her ground, not retreating or showing fear, just looking at him with those same intense blue eyes. She didn't say anything in response, but Edward could see the slight tremor in her hands. She was waiting for him to do something, to say something that would confirm she had done the right thing in coming here. But all he could think about was the life he had built, the future he had planned with Emily, and now this child, this little girl, had entered it and shattered everything he had believed. "I never knew," Edward whispered, more to himself than anyone else. "I never knew." Emily, who had been silent up until now, finally spoke, her voice quiet but full of emotion. "Edward, how could you not know? How could you not know you had a child?" Her words cut through him, and he felt the weight of her disappointment. She wasn't angry, not yet, but there was something in her eyes, a question that he didn't have the answer to. He wanted to explain, but there were no answers, not really. "I didn't know," he said again, this time louder, more to her than to Sophia. "I swear to you, Emily. I didn't know. I had no idea. I had no reason to think I—" "Edward," she interrupted, her voice filled with disbelief. You're telling me you've been living your life, working, planning a future, and you didn't think, even once, that you might have a child out there? She shook her head, the frustration in her voice growing. I need you to be honest with me. Did you really never think about this, or have you been hiding it all this time? Edward stood still, feeling like he was being torn apart from the inside. He had never considered the possibility of having a child, not with anyone from his past. His mind was always preoccupied with business, with success, with what came next. Relationships were something he always kept at arm's length, afraid of the vulnerability they required. And now, standing in front of him, was the very result of his neglect of his past, and he didn't know how to move forward. He could hear the murmurs from the guests, their whispers growing louder, their eyes trained on him and Sophia. It was clear that this was a situation no one knew how to handle. But in that moment, with the weight of the world pressing down on him, Edward understood one thing: he had to face this, for Sophia and for himself. He had to figure out how to be a father. How to be a man who would show up, even when everything he thought he knew was falling apart. I need to talk to her, Edward said quietly, motioning to Sophia, who was still standing there, waiting patiently. He turned to Emily, his heart aching. I'll explain everything, I swear. But I need to understand this myself. I need to talk to her first. Emily gave a small nod, though her face remained filled with concern. Edward didn't know how he was going to explain this to her. He didn't know how to fix the damage that had already been done. But he also knew that he couldn't ignore this any longer. Whatever this was, whatever this meant for him, it had to be faced head-on. As he approached Sophia, he knelt down to her level, trying to calm his racing thoughts. Sophia, I don't even know where to start, he began, trying to speak gently, though his voice was shaking. But I promise you, I'm not going to turn my back on you. I'm here. I'll listen. Sophia's eyes softened slightly. I just want to know you, she said quietly, her voice trembling. Edward's heart cracked. In that moment, he realized that he wasn't just dealing with a mistake or a past mistake. He was dealing with a child who needed him, and for better or worse, he couldn't walk away now. He didn't have all the answers, but for the first time in a long time, he knew he had to start trying. Edward sat in his office late that evening, the weight of the day still pressing heavily on his chest. His thoughts were a whirlwind, spinning around the revelation that had shaken him to his core. He couldn't believe what had happened, couldn't believe that a child he had never known had appeared in his life so suddenly. Sophia. His daughter. The reality of it all was almost too much to process. He had spent the entire evening in a daze, trying to wrap his mind around everything. How had this happened? Why hadn't he known about her? And what did this mean for his future with Emily? Emily had left after the ceremony. She had insisted that she needed time to think, to process everything that had happened. Edward understood, but it didn't make it any easier. The guilt was suffocating. He had been so consumed by his career, so focused on building his empire, that he had failed to see the most important part of his life staring him right in the face. How had he not known about Sophia? How had he been so blind to the possibility that he could have a child? He ran his hands through his hair, staring blankly at the papers in front of him, but none of it mattered. The work, the meetings, the contracts, it all seemed so trivial now. The most important thing in his life had just walked into his world, and he hadn't even known she existed. He didn't know how to be a father. He had no experience with children. He didn't know what he was supposed to do, what he was supposed to say. His phone buzzed, and he glanced at the screen. It was a message from Emily. *, we need to talk. I'm coming over, *. His heart sank as he read the message. He wasn't sure what to expect from this conversation, but he knew it wasn't going to be easy. He didn't blame Emily for wanting to talk. He couldn't even begin to imagine what she was feeling. She had every right to be upset, to be angry with him for keeping this secret. But as much as he wanted to explain himself, as much as he needed to make things right, part of him was terrified. How could he explain something that he didn't even understand himself? When Emily arrived, her face was a mask of calm, but her eyes were filled with uncertainty. She stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at him, before stepping inside. Edward could feel the tension in the air, thick and heavy, as if the entire room was waiting for something to give. He stood up, not sure where to begin, but knowing that silence wouldn't help them. "Emily, I don't know what to say," he started, his voice hoarse. "This has all been so overwhelming. I never knew. I never knew I had a child." Emily nodded, her arms crossed over her chest. "I know," she said quietly. "But why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you tell me about her?" Edward took a deep breath. He wanted to tell her everything, to explain how he had buried his past, how he had never imagined something like this could happen, but he couldn't find the right words. "I don't know, Emily. I wasn't ready. I didn't think it mattered. I've spent so many years focused on my career that I didn't think about the consequences of my actions." Emily's gaze softened slightly, but the hurt in her eyes was still unmistakable. "Edward, this is bigger than you and me. You can't just ignore something like this. You have a daughter now. You have a responsibility to her." Edward nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. "I know. And I've been a fool for not seeing it sooner. But I want to be there for her, Emily. I want to make this right. I know I can't undo the past, but I can try to be the father she needs." There was a long pause, and for a moment, it seemed like Emily might say something else. But instead, she just sighed, walking over to the window and looking out at the city skyline. "You don't even know where to start, do you?" Edward stood there, not knowing how to answer her. He didn't know where to start. He didn't know how to be a father. It wasn't something he had ever planned for, something he had ever prepared for. And yet, here he was, standing in front of the woman he loved, knowing that he had to find a way to make it work. For Sophia. For them. "I'm sorry, Emily," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't expect you to understand. But I need to try. I need to figure this out. For her, and for us." Emily turned to face him, her expression softening just a little. "I don't know what this means for us, Edward. I don't know how I feel about all of this. But I know that if you want to be a part of Sophia's life, then you need to start showing up. Not just for her, but for yourself, too." Edward nodded, feeling a lump form in his throat. He couldn't imagine how hard this would be for Emily. She had just found out about Sophia, and now she was trying to process everything in front of her. But despite the pain, despite the uncertainty, he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't going to walk away from this. He couldn't. No matter how difficult it was, no matter how messy it got, he was going to try. "I'll do whatever it takes," Edward said, his voice full of determination. "I'll be there for her. I'll be the father she needs. And I'll do it right." Emily looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing his words. Finally, she sighed. "I hope you mean that, Edward. Because you can't just walk away from this. You've already missed so much." "I know," he said quietly. "But I'm here now. And I'm going to try." As Emily left that night, Edward sat down at his desk again, his thoughts swirling. He didn't know how to navigate the path ahead, but he knew one thing: he was going to try. And for the first time in his life, he felt like he had something more important than his career, more important than his success. He had a daughter, and he wasn't going to let her down. Edward woke up the next morning to the sound of his phone buzzing on the nightstand. He had hardly slept the night before, the weight of everything that had happened keeping him up. His mind was racing with thoughts of Sophia, of his life, and of the future that seemed completely different from what he had imagined just a day ago. He reached for the phone and saw that it was a message from Emily. "I'm going to take some time for myself today. I think we both need space to figure things out. I'll check in later, asterisk. Edward exhaled slowly, feeling a mix of relief and dread. He understood why Emily needed space. The news about Sophia had come as a shock, and he had no idea how to help her process it, or how to begin fixing the cracks in their relationship. He couldn't blame her for needing time to think. But the reality of the situation still weighed heavily on him. He wasn't just dealing with his own confusion, he was now responsible for a child, a daughter who had come into his life so suddenly, and he had no idea how to be the father she needed. After a few moments, he pushed himself out of bed and walked over to the window. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a golden glow over the city below. He stared at the skyline, his thoughts still on Sophia. He couldn't understand how he hadn't known about her. How had he missed the most important part of his life? And what now? He had always prided himself on his ability to control everything in his life. Business, career, even relationships, he knew how to navigate them. But fatherhood was something completely different. It wasn't something he could plan or control. It wasn't about logic or strategy. It was about emotional connection, trust, and presence. He didn't know where to start. The sound of a knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. He opened it to find Sophia standing there, holding a small bag. Her blonde hair was tied in a neat ponytail, and her blue eyes, which were so much like his own, seemed filled with uncertainty. "Hi, Dad," she said quietly, her voice hesitant but hopeful. "Hey, Sophia," Edward said, his throat tightening. He wasn't sure what to say to her, not yet. It felt strange to even call her his daughter, though in that moment, he realized that he had to get used to it. He had to start building that connection. I brought some of my stuff," she continued, holding up the bag. "I wasn't sure where to go, but I thought maybe I could stay here for a bit. If that's okay." Edward paused, the weight of her request sinking in. He knew that inviting her to stay with him wasn't just about offering her a place to sleep. It was about accepting the responsibility that came with being her father. It was about showing up, being present in ways he hadn't been before. "Of course, you can stay," Edward said, his voice steady, though inside he was still struggling to grasp the enormity of what was happening. He stepped aside to let her in. "Come on in. You can stay as long as you need." Sophia nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips, though it didn't reach her eyes. She set her bag down on the couch and sat down carefully, folding her hands in her lap. Edward sat across from her, unsure of how to break the silence. The tension between them was palpable, both of them unsure of what came next. "I don't really know what to do either," Edward admitted after a long pause. "I never thought I'd be in this position. I don't know what it means to be a dad. I don't know how to be one. I'm not perfect, Sophia." She looked at him, her gaze softening. "I don't need you to be perfect. I just want to know you," she said quietly. "I just want to be with you." Edward felt a lump form in his throat at her words. He had been so consumed with guilt and regret that he hadn't even considered what Sophia really needed. She wasn't asking for a perfect father, she was asking for someone to be there, to show up, to try. And in that moment, he realized that he had to try. He had no choice but to give this a real chance, for her sake, and for his own. "I can do that," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "I can be here for you, Sophia. I don't know how, but I will figure it out. I promise." She nodded, the smallest of smiles playing on her lips. "Thanks, Dad." The rest of the day passed in a blur of small steps. Edward showed Sophia around his apartment, which felt too big and too cold now that it wasn't just his anymore. They ate lunch together, though the silence between them was still heavy. Edward tried to make conversation, but he found himself stumbling over his words. "What did you say to a child you had just met? How did you begin to build a relationship after so many years of not knowing each other?" Later, they sat together on the couch, flipping through a photo album Edward had found in a drawer. It was filled with pictures of his travels, of his past life, and of moments he had never shared with anyone. Sophia's curiosity was endless as she flipped through the pages, asking questions about each picture, about places Edward had been. It was the first time that day that Edward felt a small spark of connection with her. She was so much like him, so eager to learn, to understand. But at the same time, she was so different. She had a life of her own, a past that he had no part in. As the day turned into evening, Edward found himself thinking about how little he knew about Sophia. He didn't know what she liked to do for fun. He didn't know her favorite food or what made her laugh. He didn't know what she dreamed about. But he was beginning to realize that these things didn't matter all at once. It was okay to start slow. It was okay to learn together. The night was quiet as they sat in the living room, watching TV, both of them still feeling the weight of the past few hours. But for the first time, Edward didn't feel entirely lost. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing: he wasn't going to walk away. He had a daughter now, and that meant everything. And though the road ahead was uncertain, he was ready to take the first steps. For Sophia. For himself. And for the future they could build together. The days that followed were a blur for Edward. Every morning, he woke up early, his mind already racing with the thought of what he was supposed to do. He still didn't know how to be a father, and the overwhelming feeling of uncertainty never seemed to leave him. But despite all the confusion, there was a part of him that couldn't ignore the pull he felt towards Sophia. She was his daughter, and he had to find a way to be there for her, no matter how hard it was. The guilt he had carried for not being there earlier still gnawed at him, but he knew that staying in that place wasn't going to help anyone. He had to move forward. That first week was difficult. Sophia was adjusting to living with him, and Edward was adjusting to the reality of having her around. It wasn't just the practicalities of day-to-day life, though they were certainly challenging, it was the emotional aspect. Every time he looked at her, he saw the resemblance to himself. Her blonde hair, her blue eyes, the way she carried herself with a quiet confidence. But there was something else in her eyes, too. A wariness, a hesitation, as if she was unsure of whether she could trust him. It was understandable. She had lived most of her life without him. She had grown up without the father she now suddenly found herself living with, and that was a lot for anyone to process, let alone a child. One evening, after dinner, Edward sat with Sophia on the couch. They were watching a movie, but Edward could tell that she wasn't really paying attention. She was fidgeting with her hands, her legs crossed, her eyes darting around the room. She looked restless, as if something was on her mind. "Is everything okay?" Edward asked gently, setting his book down. His voice was low, careful not to disturb the stillness of the room. Sophia didn't look at him right away. She hesitated, as if she wasn't sure if she should answer. Finally, she looked up, her face a mix of uncertainty and vulnerability. "I don't know how to be here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to be, with you." Edward's heart broke at her words. He had spent so much time thinking about how to make things work, how to step into the role of a father, but he hadn't considered how it must feel for her. She had been thrust into a completely new life, surrounded by strangers, and now, she was expected to trust him. He reached out, gently taking her hand in his, feeling the tremble in her fingers. "You don't have to know everything right away," he said softly, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "We'll figure it out together. You don't have to be anyone you're not. Just be yourself. You're not alone anymore." Sophia nodded, but her eyes remained clouded with doubt. Edward could see that she wanted to believe him, but trust didn't come easily, especially not after years of being let down. The next few days were quieter. Sophia spent more time in her room, and Edward could feel the distance growing between them. He tried to give her space, to let her process everything at her own pace, but the silence between them began to feel suffocating. He didn't know how to bridge the gap between them. He didn't know how to be the father she needed, and the weight of that uncertainty hung over him. One evening, Edward decided to take her out for a walk. He thought it might be a good way to break the silence, to ease the tension that had been building. They walked through the park near his apartment, the evening air cool and crisp. The streets were quiet, and for the first time in a while, Edward felt like they could just be two people, walking side by side, without the pressure of trying to figure out everything all at once. "So, how was school today?" Edward asked, trying to sound casual. It felt awkward, like he was grasping at straws, but it was a start. Sophia shrugged, her hands stuffed into the pockets of her jacket. "It was fine. Nothing special. Anything you want to talk about? Friends, maybe? Anything at all?" Edward asked, hoping to get her to open up. Sophia glanced at him, her eyes flicking to his for a moment before looking away. "I don't really know anyone here," she admitted quietly. It's hard. I don't know where I fit in." Edward's heart tightened. He could hear the pain in her voice, the sadness that lingered in her words. He didn't have the answers. He didn't know how to fix it for her, but he knew he couldn't give up on her. He couldn't let her believe that she was alone in all of this. "You're not alone," he said firmly, stopping in his tracks to look at her. "You're not alone, Sophia. I'm here. I may not know what I'm doing, but I'll be here with you, no matter what." She didn't say anything at first. She just stood there, her gaze lowered to the ground, as if weighing his words. After a long silence, she spoke again, her voice a little softer. "I don't know if I can just forget everything. I don't know if I can just forget that you weren't there before." Edward's chest tightened at her words. He hadn't expected it to be easy. He hadn't expected her to just forget all the years they had missed. But hearing her say it, hearing her admit how much it hurt, made everything feel so much more real. "I don't expect you to forget," he said quietly. "I don't expect you to forgive me right away. But I can try. I can try to make things right. And I'll be here, even when it's hard." Sophia didn't say anything else, but for the first time in days, she walked a little closer to him. Edward felt a small flicker of hope in his chest. It wasn't much, but it was something. They were starting to build a bridge, however fragile it might be, between the two of them. Later that night, as they sat in the living room, Sophia turned to him and asked, Do you think we can ever be a real family?" Edward looked at her, his heart full. "I don't know yet, Sophia. But I'll keep trying. I'll do everything I can to make this work." Sophia nodded, her eyes a little softer than they had been when they first met. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. It was the beginning of something that neither of them fully understood, but it was a beginning nonetheless. And for the first time since she had walked into his life, Edward felt like he was doing the right thing. It wasn't going to be easy, and there were many hurdles still ahead, but he was willing to face them. For her. For them. For their future. The following weeks brought a quiet kind of tension. Edward had promised Sophia that he would be there for her, that he would try to make things right, but the reality of that promise was harder than he expected. Every day, he tried to find ways to connect with her, to understand her, but there were still so many walls between them. She was cautious, reserved, and often avoided his attempts to get closer. She didn't seem to want his help, and in those moments, Edward felt helpless, unsure of how to break through. He had always been a man who thrived on logic and control, but this, being a father, was something he couldn't manage through planning or strategy. He spent more time with her, taking her to school and picking her up afterward, trying to have small conversations, hoping that they might slowly build some kind of relationship. There were times when she would open up, a small smile creeping across her face as they talked about little things, her favorite shows, the books she liked to read, the way she would doodle pictures in the margins of her schoolwork. These moments felt like progress, but they were fleeting, easily overshadowed by the silence that often followed. Edward didn't know how to break the barriers, how to erase the years of absence between them. And every time she shut him out, he couldn't help but feel that he was failing her. One evening, as they were sitting in the living room, Sophia asked him a question that caught him completely off guard. She had been quiet for most of the evening, her eyes fixed on the TV, but suddenly, she turned to him and spoke, her voice soft but full of weight. "Do you think I'll ever be part of your life? Really part of it?" Edward froze, the question settling into his chest like a stone. He had always known that this moment would come, that the reality of being a parent meant facing the hard truths, but he wasn't prepared for the rawness of it. He hadn't known how much she longed for this connection, for the certainty that he would be there for her. She was still trying to figure out if she could trust him, if he would stay or leave. "You are already part of my life, Sophia," Edward said, his voice quiet, but firm. "I'm not going anywhere. I know I can't erase the past, but I'm here now. I want to be part of your life. I'm not going to stop trying." Sophia looked at him, her eyes wide with a mix of hope and skepticism. "But I don't know if I can just pretend that it's all okay. I don't know how to act like you've always been here when you haven't. I don't know how to just trust you." The words stung more than he expected. He knew she was right. Trust was something that had to be earned, and he had no right to expect it overnight. He had abandoned her, both physically and emotionally, for so many years. How could he expect her to open up to him, to love him as a father, when he had failed her before? "I don't expect you to trust me right away," Edward said quietly. "I know I don't deserve it. But I promise you, I'm going to show you that I'm here for you. I can't change the past, but I can show you that I'm not going anywhere. You don't have to pretend anything. I'll be here, whether you need me or not." Sophia's gaze softened, and for the first time in days, she didn't look away. She didn't smile, but there was a small shift in her expression, something that told Edward she was starting to believe him. It wasn't much, but it was something. They were still learning how to communicate, how to trust each other, but this was the first real moment of connection they had. The next few days were quieter, but something had changed. Sophia seemed more at ease around him, less guarded. She started asking him small questions, letting him help her with her homework, and even began to show him her drawings. It wasn't much, but it felt like progress. And for the first time, Edward felt like maybe he was doing something right. Maybe they were on their way to becoming the family he had never thought he would have. One afternoon, after school, Edward picked her up as usual. This time, they didn't speak much on the drive home, but as they reached the apartment, Sophia spoke up, her voice hesitant. "Do you think we could go to the park tomorrow? Just us?" Edward's heart skipped a beat. It was a simple request, but it meant so much. For the first time, she was asking him for something that wasn't just an obligation or a forced interaction. She wanted to spend time with him. He had no idea what this would mean for their relationship, but it was a step forward. It was a sign that maybe, just maybe, she was starting to let him in. "I'd love that," Edward said, his voice sincere. "We can go to the park. Just us. We'll make it a day." The next day, they went to the park. Edward had no idea what to expect, but as they sat on the swings together, chatting about nothing and everything, he felt a quiet sense of peace wash over him. They weren't solving all their problems, and he knew it wasn't going to be easy, but for the first time, he felt like they were on the right path. It wasn't perfect, but it was something real. And that was all he could ask for. As the day ended, Edward dropped Sophia off at the door, her smile lingering even as she went inside. He stood there for a moment, watching her disappear into the house, and he couldn't help but feel a small flicker of hope. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he was starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could be the father Sophia needed. And for the first time, that thought didn't scare him. It felt like a chance to make things right, to build something new. And he was ready to take it. Edward woke up early that morning, the sun barely peeking through the blinds, casting long shadows across the room. It had been a week since their trip to the park, and since then, things had started to shift. The silence between him and Sophia wasn't as thick anymore. There were still moments of awkwardness, moments where he felt like a stranger in his own life, but it was different. She had started to open up in ways he hadn't expected, and for the first time, he felt like there was hope that they could build something together. But it wasn't easy. There were still the questions in his mind, the fear that he was doing it all wrong, that he wasn't enough. He had no roadmap for this journey, no guide to show him how to be the father he needed to be. After a quick breakfast, Edward left for work, though his thoughts were still focused on Sophia. He found himself checking his phone more often than usual, wondering if she was okay, wondering how she was feeling. He was starting to care about her in ways that he had never anticipated, and it was both comforting and terrifying. The more he got to know her, the more he realized how much they had missed, how much time they had lost. It made him feel like a failure, but at the same time, it made him more determined to try harder. Later that day, as Edward sat in his office, he received a text from Sophia. *, can you pick me up after school today? I have something I want to talk to you about, *. His heart skipped a beat as he read the message. What could she want to talk about? Was something wrong? He felt a surge of anxiety, but he pushed it aside, telling himself that it was probably nothing. He immediately replied, telling her he would pick her up. By the time the school bell rang, Edward was waiting outside, his eyes scanning the crowd for her. He saw her in the distance, walking slowly toward him, her head down as she fiddled with the straps of her backpack. She looked lost in thought, and for a moment, Edward hesitated. He had come to understand that it wasn't just about being present, it was about being able to truly understand her, to see beyond the walls she had built up over the years. He had started to realize that, for all the strides they had made, there was still a lot of ground to cover. When Sophia saw him, she gave him a small, tentative smile. "Hey," she said, her voice quiet but warm. "Hey," Edward replied, his heart feeling lighter at the sight of her smile. "How was school?" "It was fine," she said, shrugging. "I just wanted to talk to you about something." Edward's stomach tightened again, but he didn't show it. He didn't want to make her feel like she had to be afraid to talk to him. He nodded, trying to stay calm. "Of course. Let's talk." They got in the car, and as they drove home, there was a slight tension in the air, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of quiet that was filled with anticipation, the kind of silence that happens when something important is about to be said. Edward glanced over at her occasionally, but he didn't rush her. He had learned that with Sophia, it was better to give her time to speak on her own terms. When they reached the apartment, they sat down together in the living room. Sophia took a deep breath and then looked up at him, her eyes serious. "I've been thinking," she began, her words slow but deliberate. "And I think I want to know more about you. About everything. I mean, I know you're my dad now, but I still don't know a lot about you." Edward was caught off guard by her words. It wasn't what he had expected, but it was exactly what he needed to hear. She wanted to know him. She wanted to understand who he was, what he had been through, and how he fit into her life. In that moment, Edward realized that the real work was just beginning. He wasn't just learning to be a father, he was also learning to let her in, to share his own life with her. It was the kind of vulnerability he had avoided for so long, but it was the only way forward. "I don't really know where to start," Edward said honestly, running a hand through his hair. "I've always kept a lot of things to myself, but I can try. I want you to know who I am. I'll tell you whatever you want to know." Sophia nodded, her expression softening. "I don't need to know everything at once," she said, her voice tinged with a quiet understanding. "But I want to know the important stuff. I want to know about you. What was your life like before? What do you like to do? I want to understand who you are." Edward took a deep breath. This was it, the moment where he would start to really open up to her, to give her the answers she was seeking. He had been so focused on trying to fix things, trying to make up for the lost time, that he had never stopped to really reflect on his own life, on the person he had been before Sophia came into it. It was a daunting thought, but he knew it was time to let go of his walls. Well, he began, leaning forward slightly, his voice steady, I've spent most of my life focused on my career. I built my company from the ground up, and it became my world. It's hard to look back and think about all the things I missed out on because I was so consumed by work. I wasn't the best at balancing things, and I know I made mistakes. I wasn't there when you needed me. And I can never change that, no matter how much I wish I could. Sophia didn't interrupt. She just listened, her eyes fixed on him, and Edward continued. I used to think that success was everything, that if I could just keep building, keep achieving, that I would have everything I wanted. But now I realize it was all empty without people to share it with. I've been alone for a long time, and I don't want to be anymore. Sophia's eyes softened as she listened. For the first time, she didn't look at him with suspicion or uncertainty. She was hearing him, understanding him in a way that felt new to both of them. I think, Sophia said quietly, I understand now. You didn't know how to be a dad. You didn't know how to be there for me. But you're trying now. And that's what matters. Edward felt a lump form in his throat. I'll keep trying, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I'm here for you, Sophia. I always will be. The room was quiet for a moment, the weight of their conversation hanging in the air. But for the first time since they had met, it wasn't uncomfortable. It wasn't filled with doubt or fear. It was filled with understanding, with the beginning of a bond that neither of them had expected but both were starting to feel. I'm glad you're here, Sophia said softly, breaking the silence. I'm glad we're trying to make this work. Edward smiled, a genuine smile that felt like it came from deep within. Me too. Edward woke up the next morning with a sense of quiet anticipation. The conversation with Sophia the night before had shifted something inside him. For the first time, he felt like they were moving forward, like they were starting to bridge the gap between father and daughter. It wasn't going to be easy, and he knew there would be more difficult conversations ahead, but something about the way Sophia had listened to him, the way she had finally opened up, made him believe that this could work. That maybe, just maybe, they could build something real together. After a quick breakfast, Edward drove Sophia to school, the car ride unusually comfortable. There was still a sense of hesitation between them, but it felt lighter, less strained. As they arrived at the school, Sophia turned to him, her eyes meeting his. Thanks for talking to me last night, she said softly, her voice carrying a sincerity that made Edward's heart swell. I feel like I understand you a little better now. And I think I can trust you more now. Edward smiled at her, his heart swelling with pride and emotion. I'm glad, Sophia. I'm going to keep trying. I know I've got a long way to go, but I'm here for you. Always. She smiled back at him, a small but genuine expression that made him feel like they had taken a step in the right direction. I know, she said, before quickly grabbing her backpack and heading toward the school entrance. As he watched her walk away, Edward felt a renewed sense of purpose. It wasn't just about being there for Sophia. It was about making up for the time lost, about proving to her, and to himself, that he could be the father she needed. There were no guarantees in life, but this felt like a chance, a real opportunity to start over, to build a new relationship with his daughter, no matter how difficult it might be. The rest of the day passed in a blur of meetings and emails. But Edward couldn't shake the thought of Sophia from his mind. He found himself checking his phone more often, waiting for a message from her, wondering if she was okay, if she was settling in at school. When he finally had a break, he picked up his phone and sent her a quick text, "How was your day?" He didn't expect an immediate response, but to his surprise, a few minutes later, his phone buzzed with a message from her. Asterisk it was good. I'm glad we talked. I feel better, asterisk. Edward smiled as he read the message, feeling a wave of relief wash over him. It wasn't much, but it was enough. It was the kind of message that told him that maybe, just maybe, they were on the right path. Later that evening, after dinner, Edward and Sophia sat down together in the living room. They had been getting more comfortable with each other, and this time, there was no awkward silence. They were talking about small things, school, her favorite books, the things she liked to do in her spare time. Edward was listening carefully, trying to learn as much as he could about her, to understand the person she was becoming. He wanted to know everything, her fears, her dreams, the things that made her laugh and the things that made her cry. He knew that it would take time, but he was determined to be there for her in every way he could. Sophia seemed more at ease, too. Her shoulders were no longer tense, and she didn't look at him with the same uncertainty she had when they first started this journey. There were still moments of hesitation, but they were fewer now. The walls that had once stood between them were slowly starting to crumble, and it was happening in small, almost imperceptible ways. She was starting to trust him, and that was more than he could have hoped for. So, Edward began, his voice casual, though his heart was beating a little faster. What do you think about spending the weekend together? Maybe we can do something fun. Just you and me. Sophia looked at him, her eyes thoughtful for a moment before she nodded. Yeah, that sounds nice. What do you want to do? Edward smiled. How about we go to that art museum you like? I know you've been wanting to go back there. Her face lit up at the suggestion. I'd love that. I've been wanting to see that new exhibit. We can go on Saturday, right? Absolutely, Edward said. It's a plan. Sophia smiled, and for the first time, Edward didn't feel like he was pushing. She wanted to spend time with him, too. He could see it in the way she looked at him, in the way she was starting to include him in her life. It wasn't perfect, and he knew they still had a long way to go, but it was progress. Real progress. The weekend arrived, and Edward picked Sophia up from school, their usual routine now feeling comfortable and natural. They spent the day at the museum, wandering through the exhibits, talking about the paintings and sculptures, laughing at the silly things they saw. It was a simple day, but it was one of the most meaningful days Edward had experienced in a long time. For the first time in his life, he felt like he was truly building something that mattered, not a business empire or a successful career, but a relationship with his daughter. As they walked through the museum, stopping to admire different works of art, Sophia looked up at him and said, I'm glad we're doing this. I feel like we're really starting to know each other. Edward felt a lump form in his throat at her words. He had been afraid that he would never be able to make up for the years they had lost, but in that moment, he realized that it wasn't about the years. It was about what they were doing now, what they were building in the present. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And it was enough. I'm glad too, Sophia, Edward said softly. This is what matters. You matter. They walked together in silence for a few moments, side by side, and for the first time in a long time, Edward felt a deep sense of peace. It wasn't about having all the answers. It wasn't about being perfect. It was about being present, about showing up when it mattered. And for the first time, he truly understood what it meant to be a father. The road ahead was still uncertain, but he knew one thing for sure, they were on it together. And that was enough.